The din of battle fled the darkness, and I recovered the remaining names I had inherited from the dead hunter's murder list. I looked into the night. It was thinly pierced by the tiny amber lights of distant glowing windows. What power or device illuminated the rooms behind those windows I could not say. They shined like gentle stars made from the calm of autumn, and the moon, while visible, seemed restrained by the city's darkness. Only the dimmest light drifted down to the world below. As I took in these exquisite sights, the wind grappled with my coat and snatched at my hair and beard. I took a deep breath, wondering if I inhaled air or darkness. A slightly elevated rooftop hung nearby, well within range of a spirited leap. So I climbed into the night. I managed an impressive height by means of scaling rooftops, yet I soon reached the apex of my ascent. My destination was visible at this vantage, a distant and nearly collapsed apartment high-rise. Traveling the open streets was too risky an alternative, so I decided to find another way across to the next building. After I quietly laid my shoulder into it, the rooftop door opened with a small pop. The tiny noise flitted down the narrow stairwell and would have gained the hallways below had it not been for my expanding silence. I descended to the first stairwell door, entering the hallway of the 14th floor. The passage was dark and utterly quiet, so I crept along like a spider, plucking at the shadows, testing the way ahead. Suddenly, the sound of a cracking whip exploded into the hallway. A few seconds later, a pulsing amber light made its way into the darkness of the corridor, emerging from an open doorway several apartments away. I could detect something advancing beneath the silence, displacing shadows as it moved. Sidestepping into the apartment next to me, I disappeared into the null of forgotten places. Music of some sort began to melt out of the air, blowing softly across the hallway and into my hiding place. The lights in the hall turned on and dimmed to the weakest orange glimmer, soon followed by the lights inside the apartment I occupied. Eager to see what would come next, and with my silence wrapped securely around me, I took the most comfortable seat in the room and waited for whatever was to happen. The music became almost tangible, forming a kind of transparent membrane that settled across the room, invading everything. The light itself blended into the mysterious composition as the wax and wane of the tender illumination transitioned into floating, glowing notes. The cadence of my breathing merged into the developing harmony, and the movement of my very thoughts dissolved into nothing more than an accompanying rhythm. I was being absorbed into the music. I tried to think past the horde of deadly sounds, but every new thought became a note within the growing storm of voracious melodies. My only hope was the quiet. I could feel the hungry music trying to master and devour it. But my silence was unyielding. That area of the contest became the focus of my attention. I listened as I never had before, to a silent song only I could hear. Suddenly the hungry sounds vanished from the room, moving past me down the hall, still eating away at the world by means of the most beautiful music. With the nightmare music gone, I slipped from the room and re-entered the hallway, approaching the apartment where the unearthly music seemed to have come from. I took to the deepest shadows, minding my every movement, yet I couldn't resist peering as far into the room as I could. The apartment was filled with rusted musical instruments. They were suspended from the walls by large hooks, strung with glistening webs of what seemed to be saliva. Sitting in the middle of the room was a man sharply dressed in the dusty apparel of an orchestra conductor. Instead of a conductor's baton, his right hand held what appeared to be a lion tamer's whip. He was apparently sound asleep, bearing the signature features of a man afflicted with the advanced stages of the infamous sleeping sickness. His eyes were completely sealed shut, so much so that there was no distinguishing the fact that eyes had ever occupied the unbroken expanses of smooth skin that now lay placid and pale above his cheeks. He sat disturbingly still, only occasionally whimpering a muted cry in his sleep. Yet the pathetic sound seemed to come from an impossible distance, buried somewhere deep within the man, as if he were crying out from the yawning depths of a deep black pit. The sleeping man's apartment came equipped with a fire escape. After squeezing myself carefully through a large window, I paused to survey the night air and the dank alley below. I pondered my chances of getting out of the city alive, or more accurately, awake. My eyelids had already gathered more weight than was normal, and sleep seemed more and more like the only solution to my diminishing endurance. Yet sleep was the very den of monsters that had stolen New Victoria from the waking world in the first place, and I was certain such creatures would make for poor hosts, should I decide to pay them a visit. A twin fire escape clung to the building across the alley. The distance was outside my comfort zone, but not my ability. A mighty leap saw me to the other side, my silence embracing the impact and keeping my presence from the city's many predators. I climbed the fire escape to the roof, ever aware of things that might be looking down at me from the black gulfs of the carrion sky, eager to catch me off my guard. Yet I also felt my family's vigilance surrounding me like smoke. They were just as eager to catch whatever thing might mistake me for prey and render it subject to their gleaming smiles and thunderous laughter. When I arrived at the top of the building, I caught sight of a glassed-in penthouse replete with a spacious veranda. Interestingly, a large telescope sat affixed to the outermost rim of the balcony. The worlds that wheeled overhead were pale alternatives to the sights I hoped to glimpse by pointing the wonderful device downward. So I aimed my magnified gaze at the concrete forest around me. With any luck, lit windows might grant me further insight into the delightful nightmares that pretended to be an abandoned city. A lingering curiosity concerning the strange quartet of women caused me to turn the glass towards the east end of the town, the direction from which they had most likely come. Their original number had dwindled, my father having seen personally to the subtraction, but I was curious to know the fate of the remaining 3. After some effort, and as if responding to my unspoken wish, I caught sight of something moving through the alleyways of the hospital I had previously visited. It was one of the women. She was strapped to a hospital gurney that was being conducted down a poorly lit corridor. The gurney was propelled by a power largely imperceptible, and I could only discern some kind of presence by the effects it exercised upon the shadows it touched. The darkness of the hallway seemed to adhere to the invisible thing, clinging to it like tar and supplying it with only a minimal suggestion of shape and size. The outlining shadows described a thing of nonsensical construction, an organism that begrudged nothing to the traditional symmetries of Earthen biology, and partook its shape solely from the unprincipled reasoning of chaos. The unorthodox creature continued to push the gurney down the hallway, occasionally wiping the dripping shadows from the amorphous swelling that rose high and hideous from her abdomen. From behind her stretched flesh, the dim outline of the germinating nightmare was scarcely visible as a mass of shifting darkness, twisting and flipping as if it were trying to put itself together, one inhuman limb at a time. Suddenly, the head of the thing obtained a terrible definition as it pressed hard against its cage of flesh. It seemed to turn its attention towards the captured woman, leering into her panicked face. The unborn creature projected its hungry glare beyond its gilding of human skin, laying a cold glow across the dull and sightless eyes of its mother, eyes that had long since lost their connection to the world beyond and behind them. The woman was finally delivered into a large room, lit only by a small collection of tapered candles. After placing the woman in the middle of the room, her monstrous guide waddled back down the hallway by which it came, leaving wet shadows in its tracks. The woman struggled against the bonds that secured her head, arms, and feet to the gurney. However, after careful observation, I realized that her movements were not her own, but rather the actions of the thing within her. Her body, nothing more than a massive gestational sac, began to rapidly swell beyond the scope of the gurney. Her bulging flesh spilling to the floor and rolling across the dirty tile like tides of thick mud. All the while, the woman's facial expression never changed. Her mind and body had become nothing but the debris of madness. Just a broken doll splayed out in the aftermath of a tornado. The thing that had once been a woman began to burst apart from the inside, releasing a septic spray of inhuman fluids that drowned all the candles in the room save one. By the glow of that lone flame, the infant nightmare stripped off its mother like wet clothing, dropping what was left of her in a steaming heap of molten flesh. The creature waved its dainty and human hand before its eyes, inspecting the solidity of its new world, perhaps wondering if its hand might turn to smoke, or if the air would transmute suddenly into a cold sound that only the dead could hear. Evidently quite satisfied with its new accommodations, it smiled with 1,000 tiny teeth and walked off into the darkness of the outer hallway, disappearing like a secret floating into silence.
Mirror brides, breeders of foulest nightmare, those women. Men like you, why, you're our beasts of burden, naturally.
The voice came from behind me. I whipped around to find a man floating above the floor, a ridiculous stovepipe hat on his head, his eyes the strangest I'd ever seen. Where conventional eyes should have been, there was only a thin covering of flesh. Yet it was behind that seal of skin where glowed a bright set of alien blue eyes, bright enough to backlight the tiny network of veins and other nuances of intervening tissue. The radiant blue of his eyes behind flesh was the color of sleep, and it washed over me like a gentle water, sweeping me out to strange seas. I knew I had to escape the glow of the creature's billowing eyes. They possessed a depth far deeper and more dangerous than a distance from the balcony to the ground. So I jumped from the building. I tumbled far longer than necessary to complete my descent, and the further I plummeted, the lighter my body felt. By the time I reached the streets below, I was nearly weightless. When my feet finally touched the ground, I looked up at the city. It had changed considerably. It was the dread face of New Victoria I had witnessed only once before. I suddenly realized my mistake. I hadn't actually fallen from the building, but had suffered a far worse fate. I had fallen asleep.